Hello, everyone. Welcome back to the next episode of Streamtime Sports. My name is Chris Stone. I'm the community lead, joined as always by our CEO, Nick Meacham. Now, Nick, it is officially the proverbial dog days of summer, as we call it back in America. It's really the only thing that's on TV at the moment. The NBA season's finished. The NHL season's finished. We're still a month away before we get preseason NFL football and college football. And it's just a bit of a slow time, and it's hot and, it's just kind of, like I said, the dog days of summer. Now, you're from Australia. It's in the middle of winter. So I don't know if I've ever actually asked this, Nick. I think of winter in America, November, December, you got the NFL, college football, NBA started back up, NCAA basketball, all of that. Is the wintertime a busy time for Australian sports, or does your sports season kind of reflect ours? It's weird. Sometimes I forget that you do Christmas in the summer and your summers are winter. It throws me off sometimes.
Yeah, so at this time of year, you're right in the thick of the AFL and NRL seasons, which are the two main football codes in the country. So really at the heart and soul of the TV will be filled with lots of various football going on all year round. And Australians do love pretty much every sporting event possible. So they'll also be watching the Euros, that's for sure, for those that are willing and able to get up at those sorts of hours, which are normally pretty uncomfortable for most. In the summer months in Australia, typically cricket is the main sport of choice, actually. So you'll have big staples like the Boxing Day Test, which is played in Melbourne, which has something like, I don't even know what the MCG fits now, but it's like 100,000 people. It's over 90. I'm not sure if it's over 100 because they did some renovations, but it's an enormous stadium. It's like that date in the diary, a bit like Thanksgiving in the NFL, where everyone at home will either watch the first ball and watch the Boxing Day Test day one kickoff. And there's also a whole host of other sporting events on that day. I've been to Boxing Day Test a couple of times, and it's an amazing experience. By the end of 8 hours of watching cricket, you kind of get a bit lost after a few beers as to what you're actually watching and paying attention to, but it is still a lot of fun. So cricket really is in the summer months, so over December, January, February, is really the core focus sport over there.
Now, one of the things I didn't realize happened, but you told me it does happen in very remote parts of the country at certain times of the year. So would this be the time of year you'd be going skiing if you were back at home?
Normally a bit later on the year, yeah, but you can. So there's basically something called the Great Dividing Range, where there's a mountain range that runs all the way down. It's like follows the coastline, and it goes down from up near just south of Brisbane, and it goes all the way down thousands of kilometers, basically down towards Melbourne. At the base of that, the very southern sort of part of that range is a set of various sets of mountains. Not just there, but that's sort of it feeds off this Great Dividing Range, which is this mountain range. And there can be some pretty good skiing in there and snowboarding. I've been a few times. There's one place that has something like 50 lifts, if I remember correctly. It's either Perisher Blue, I think it used to be called. I've been to a place called Mount Hotham, which I think had 13 lifts at the time. One day I went snowboarding, but this is the challenge with Australia, right? The first year I went, 2-meter snow base, so really good snow, great experience. I was not very good, but a good environment to learn. The next year we came back, and it was actually towards the mid to end of September. It's the end of the season, and what started to happen was it started to get towards around 10 degrees Celsius, middle of the day, and so what would literally happen is it was like you were snowboarding or skiing on a slushy. That it was just so melted and watery, and basically you could almost feel it. You come down the same run 15 minutes later, and you could see more rocks than you could the last time around. So it was a good incentive not to fall, but I was just snowboarding in a t-shirt because it was just too hot. T-shirt, and if I got wet, it was fine because I just gave me an extra incentive not to fall over. So Australia's has got some good skiing if the weather works. But it can also turn on a dime because the weather can easily get pretty hot pretty quickly. So you have to be very smart with how you plan. I think it is around July is normally the best time from memory. But I mean, all seasons these days in every country have changed a little bit, right? In Sweden, I know that quite often the main snowfall starts to come now in January, and somewhere between January and closer to Easter even there's some snowfall, whereas it used to be always you get something in December. So it keeps moving.
Well, the one interesting thing now that we've switched over to the Nordics, come for the sports media, stay for the weather and regional, specifics about weather and nature and all that. Is yeah, there's no nighttime in like Scandinavia this time of year. I remember going out to Finland 2 years ago, and I remember getting to the hotel at 1 o'clock and the sun was still up. It was so bizarre, Nick. I don't know if it's quite like that where your wife's family's from in Sweden, but I just remember like I think the sun was maybe only down for about 90 minutes. It's very bizarre.
Yeah, so most of the population of the Scandi countries is in the bottom third. So, particularly of Sweden, it's in the bottom third. The next two thirds is pretty empty. But if you go up to the top, yeah, it's you see. I think you'll see the sun all day long. They have midsummer, which has just happened, which is basically I think it's the longest day of the year, if I remember correctly, and that's a quite a big moment for everyone to celebrate and enjoy. And they do all sorts of crazy dances and activities around that. It's quite funny to watch, but I won't talk about that here. Yeah, it's really weird when you're particularly. I'll tell you what, it's difficult if you got kids as well, because I did like try and tell them, look, it's nighttime. You should be going to sleep now. They're like, well, the sun's. I can literally see the sun outside, and try and tell the 3-year-old what that means. But yeah, it's quite cool. I mean, it's amazing if you can just go out for a walk, for a run. You can play golf. You can play any sport till all parts of the day, and you don't have to worry about trying to get back at the right time. It's a cool experience for those few months, and that's why summer in some of those countries is so amazing, because you can just do whatever you like at whatever time. It's pretty mild still, even if on a hot day you're talking 25 degrees Celsius. It's it's hardly overwhelming. So a good time to be in those countries in the summer months, that's for sure. A little bit different when you get to the winter months where it's pitch black, though, obviously. But
well, back to the dog days of summer. It's a little bit unique this summer. In Europe, we've got the Euros. In America, you've got the Copa America. Today, as we're recording, is the start of Wimbledon. Tour de France starts soon. And then later at the end of July, we have the Summer Olympics in Paris. And it brings us to the topic we're going to discuss today. We quite frequently talk about the Premier League, the NFL, the NBA, these essentially several month-long competitions, primarily where most of the money is focused and where most of our competitions that we talk about are focused. But today we're going to talk about these major events and sort of what their value is to the industry and how we deal with fan engagement on those sides, because it is a slightly different proposition. And I think it's also interesting. You look at more and more of the prominent rights holders are going behind paywalls and subscription models, whereas it does seem like most of these major events tend to be a bit more free to air, and just kind of talking about the comparisons between the two types of events. So I suppose, Nick, just to sort of jump off to start there, let's look at it from the rights holders perspective, and then later on we'll look at it from the broadcaster's perspective. From a rights holder perspective, say you're Wimbledon, or say you're, the Tour de France. How are you going to broadcasters and trying to sell your rights when they have deals in place with these longer, I guess you could say a better sense of investment over a long period of time?
It's interesting. It is a really interesting thing to look at when you compare it to the leagues that you've talked about, because they do have a different mindset, a different way of thinking. Ultimately, these events are single moments, effectively, in the calendar year that not only they're able to build up to, so they have a longer planning cycle, but indeed the partners they work with are able to you really get all their ducks in a row to make sure they maximize that opportunity. So typically what you see with most of the major events is sometimes in different markets. So for example, in the UK, there is regulation in place that the free-to-air broadcasters have to have a proportion of those rights available on those channels. We've seen some of events and questions being asked of that sort of system, because it means that potentially some of these major events aren't able to generate as much revenue as they would otherwise, because some of the pay TV providers might be more keen to tap into the power and the influence a major event has. Because, let's think what a major event does. It brings a big, massive audience to a platform for a concentrated amount of time. It's the perfect type of acquisition tool. But yet, because one of the challenges there is when you have a lot of these events, like, let's say the Tour de France has a portion of its audience which are hardcore cyclists and hardcore fans. What makes Tour de France so special is it draws in people like me who aren't a hardcore cyclist fan, but the stories, the broadcast footage they show of France, it's just such a captivating viewing experience and something so unique. But if they started putting 10 of the major cycling events on on TV on the major channels. Would I watch them? Probably not. I would either watch that one, or the pinnacle of what that major event provides to a broadcaster is really dissipated. So by the absence of more of those sporting events being available, I think it creates an incredible amount of inertia behind it, and that's really, really valuable to the broadcasters that they have. Now, the major events partners, let's say the couple of examples you gave with Wimbledon, Tour de France, typically they've always been quite smart at not just chasing the best financial deal. They have been always good at having their content at least proportionally on free-to-air services, making sure it's available to a wider audience, and then maybe having a portion available through pay. Tour de France, I think it's available on ITV, which is the free-to-air commercial broadcaster here, but also a good portion of those rights are available through Discovery's channels, who's got a huge cycling footprint. So there's some similarities there, but you really do see free-to-air playing a much more important, vital role to these major events because of the huge net that they can generate for reaching generalist audiences and bringing them into something they're not used to watching. And those types of audiences just aren't as likely to spend on buying a subscription to something to watch a one-off event. If I'm only a generalist, I have to be a passionate cycling fan if I want to pay for a subscription to watch the Tour de France, right? That's naturally the most higher propensity persona type. So that's the main difference, is just that you see a lot of it mainly on free-to-air TV still, which is great. And that is a great funnel to connect people to these huge sporting events. And they still continue to do so well in engaging audiences, getting real significant ratings. But it just means the commercial model is different as well. Obviously, it's much more geared towards, there is a proportion of broadcast revenue, but a lot more of it is about these annual, longer-term sponsor deals where they're able to give the biggest audience possible to these really blue chip premium brands. If you look at all those major events, typically they're much more blue chip and premium than you look at the football clubs and leagues that exist across the world.
So we talked about it in the UK. Part of the reasons on free to air is there's a legal requirement for it to do so. Let's say that requirement didn't exist, or we're looking at other countries. Do you still think, and I'm not trying to put words in your mouth based on your previous response, would it even be in their best interest to not go free to air? We talk about the split between reach versus revenue for something that, you're talking maybe is only on air for 2 to 3 weeks. Is it more important to get as many eyeballs as possible as opposed to trying to drive a subscription? We talked a little bit about this when FIFA was launching FIFA Plus, if long term they would ever put the World Cup behind a paywall, and whether or not that actually would make more sense. They might draw more revenue, but what do you do for the other 3 years in between competitions? Even if, free to air wasn't a requirement, would it even make sense for them to not go free to air?
Great question. I think it comes down to actually a pretty simple question, is what is the objective of the organization that's running that event? And that's a pretty cliche thing. It depends on what your objectives are as to what you want to do. But think about it through the lens of, in theory, if you're an international federation or a governing body, you have to be focused about growing the game, generating as much exposure as possible to the sport you own. The revenue can only do a certain part of that job, and you got to continue to grow awareness, excitement about your sport, so it continues to grow and drive more mass participation, more audiences, more interest in the sport as a whole. With someone like ASO, so Amaury Sports Organization, who own the Tour de France, they are a private organization, privately owned. So they may be more opportunistic with how they drive commercial revenues through pay TV, or certainly more open to the idea of doing more commercial deals with those partners. But what ASO, as an example, has been able to do really well is they drive huge revenue through hosting relationships with the Grand Depart, which is where they basically start the race in all sorts of different cities. You'll see one year it's in Rotterdam, the next it's in Yorkshire, the next it's in another country. Basically what they're trying to do is they leverage opportunity. It's a cool, exciting way to grow the Tour de France's footprint into other countries, but also there's a great commercial interest. And those countries or cities do it because they want the global tourism impact that it has by being broadcast on the Tour de France, reaching as bigger audience as possible. So their established relationships typically have been built, commercial relationships have been typically built around this free-to-air mass audience, mass interest reach. But if they were private, they definitely would have a much privately owned, then they're much more likely to, I guess, consider taking more more pay TV money because of ultimately cash pays the bills and fills the coffers. But if you look at all these major events we're sort of talking about, very few of them are owned by private entities, private organizations. They have a governing body or an international federation that runs them and operates them. So, even if you look at what happens with Wimbledon in the UK, the All England Lawn Tennis Club runs that. They put all that money, they're basically not for profit. So they put all that money back into investing either into the federation, into giving it to the LTA, or investing it back into delivering a better event and experience for the next year round. But they just generate huge amounts of income off the back of that. Now, if that was a private organization, the motivations, the objectives would definitely steer them in a different direction. So that's really, I think, the main difference there. And I think you see that in sports, right, where those all commercial organizations that are much more commercially focused, privately owned and operated, definitely would take a different approach, be looking at the money much more closely than perhaps some of these other events and governing bodies are.
Now, let's flip it to the other side from a broadcaster's perspective. Now, we've talked about in the UK, there's some restrictions around it, but as a broadcaster, what is the value in some of these major events, and how do you perhaps determine what that value is? Because if you've spent money on a Premier League, on an NFL, these longer investments, how do you then justify something that's only 2 to 3 weeks? As you're dividing up the pie, figuring out how much is that mass peak moment worth compared to this consistent, steady diet of attention. Where do they draw those lines? I appreciate we would get, we would love to be able to sit in some of those rooms and hear those discussions. But what would you think, Nick?
Well, we did that podcast a few weeks ago that I did with the guys from Transmit with regards to advertising, and one of the things we did talk about in that conversation was around the need and desire for advertisers still to be in and around major moments in society, let alone in sports. And I think that's why maybe free-to-air broadcasters, if they're commercial particularly, do take the opportunity to have these events on their channels, because they have commercial relationships with advertisers. But advertisers are looking for moments. So why would I spend my money with you today versus spending it with another entity or another channel, whether it be social media, programmatic advertising, general sponsorship, etc. They're looking for key moments. They want to be part of these emotional moments where it has real impact if my brand is associated with something that's creating an emotive moment for the fans and customers or consumers that are watching the experience. So honestly, that is the main benefit for free-to-air broadcasters if they're commercial. Where it gets tricky is when they're non-commercial. So the example of the BBC. BBC, again, I'm using the UK because I'm not as au fait with other markets, but I think it's pretty transferable to other countries. If you're a government or taxpayer-funded public service broadcaster, it becomes really tricky if you have to start paying premiums on broadcasting content. And that means that the taxpayer has to foot that bill in some way, shape, or form. Whereas if you're non-commercial but it's free to air, they know how they're going to make that up. They're going to sell advertising against it. They can do the numbers and work out how much revenue they can create and see if it's worthwhile doing. And that's really as simple as that. They are really good at focusing on, they'll sell sponsorship of the broadcast itself. They'll sell sponsorship of ad breaks. They will sell sponsorship inventory and advertising inventory in a similar way that maybe a traditional sports league or broadcaster might try and approach it for leagues and clubs. But they're able to generate much more value because the audience numbers are so significant. Brands just want to be connected to those big moments and be part of the conversation when everyone's really focused on one moment or one instant or one event.
So with these major events, Nick, and I'm sure this must come up in the conversations for the broadcasters when speaking to the rights holders, how impactful do you think it is when they start talking about time zones for some things like Wimbledon or Tour de France? They're annual, the time zones don't change, but for these 4-year events like the World Cup or the Olympics where they're hopping all over the globe, surely that's got to play a role. I think back to the last FIFA Women's World Cup that was hosted in Australia. not that I ever really thought it was going to be blacked out, but there's a time I think FIFA was saying that the World Cup was going to be blacked out for England, Germany, France, Spain, and Italy because they just couldn't get any deals done because the local broadcasters didn't want to pay for games that just weren't aired when no one was watching. So, how impactful do you think that is when these negotiations are taking place?
Yeah, I do remember that story quite well. And you're just thinking, it's great to say if you're the president of FIFA, Gianni, to say, oh, well, you want all this extra revenue coming in now because the game has grown so much. But it does make a massive impact if you don't have the games on at the right time in key markets like America, like Europe, etc. Like they aren't going to pay a premium for something that is not going to deliver the results they need, which is ultimately audiences and eyeballs and revenue from potentially advertisers or subscribers. In the instance that when you talk about the question, I think it's a great question. The big thing that comes to mind for me is looking at the IOC and its deal with NBC. Now that deal was a real game changer at the time. It was, I think, even before the Olympic channel was launched, and they were creating their own dedicated channels and services built around that. But the question mark for a lot of us was there was a huge growth in the value of that deal from the previous cycle. But the question mark was, you've got Pyeongchang, you've got Beijing, you've got Tokyo happening through this period of time during the cycle. And then it finishes really well with Paris and LA. But to have events happening in a completely different market where most of the major events would be happening at bad time zones create a really complex situation to value the rights, but also then to just coordinate what events to have when. Basically, the NBC starts to draw a bit of power when you're the biggest investor into the broadcasting rights to say, hey, we want this 100-meter final at this time because it serves our audience. Well, how can you do that when it's literally in the middle of the night in that country when we're running those live events? So they started to do things like doing non-live broadcasting, basically delay the broadcast on their channels. But naturally, in this day and age with social media, that sort of approach is really flawed and is always going to fall short because people are just going to find that information of who won, whether it's the video clip or whether it's just the info. They'll just find it on social media the second they wake up if they're interested in that event. So it's become a really tricky balancing act, I think, for NBC and the IOC to work out how to approach that, particularly for those events. And probably the IOC will tell you that they're not impacted by broadcasters as to when they broadcast stuff, but they'd be mad not to try and make sure those big events weren't on at the right times for the US market in particular. But now with Paris in a much better time zone, they can really sync up the right events at the right times to serve the US market, which, let's face it, is the key driver of revenue for the IOC's media output. And then, of course, LA. Well, LA will be their big swan song on the deal, if I remember correctly, to make sure that they get as much value out of it as possible. And we no doubt there's going to be an incredible array of commercial return coming around that event that we can't even get our heads around what they can do around sponsorship of the broadcast, around advertising. Now that there's Peacock, how are they going to split up their rights again to make sure they're getting all the value out of it? But yeah, the time zone bit does definitely have a huge impact on the value, particularly when the US is impacted. Even in countries like Australia, I knew a huge amount of people that would get up in the morning at crazy hours just to watch the Tour de France, to watch the World Cup, the Euros. But granted, it's not a generalist audience. That's a passionate fan base audience. And you're not going to get the scale you need when you haven't got the time zones right.
So sticking with the Olympics specifically, we got to speak to Timo Lume a little over a year ago, and he's the one that set up the top program, the Olympic Partners. You mentioned earlier just the quality of these events. Sponsorship's not exactly tied into media, but it's not unrelated. There'll be advertising that goes into that from a digital perspective. Does the fact that the quality of the sponsors for these events tell you, I guess, why it's still valuable for broadcasters to get involved when you just look at who's coming in for these? I think you mentioned earlier, football clubs don't get these types of tier sponsors, but the Olympics and the World Cup, it's Coca-Cola's and it's all the biggest brands out there.
Well, you don't get these types of deals happening with lower tier companies, mainly because the IOC is asking such an insane amount of money for those rights. So really, you just negate anyone who is even a major challenger brand to be able to, do you have a few billion to spare to sign up to this deal? And the answer is almost always no. The crazy thing with the Olympics is for those that have watched, the Olympics and sort of taken note, there's next to no brand exposure at these events. It's so clean and lean with like visibility for these brands. That's part of the reason that if you are a brand partner of the Olympics and the Olympic moments, you won't be competing with a lot of people. But that's where you see some ambush marketing happening, which is catch a lot of people off guard or create such a ruckus within the industry. Because remember when Beats turned up and they had everyone wearing their Beats headphones going on to like the swimming stage and onto the athletics track, and that was like the best piece of marketing you could possibly have. They would be the probably number one or two brand linked with the Olympics that time around, because they were seen constantly and talked about in a lot of the broadcast, which is at the huge discomfort of a lot of probably the major sponsors who are spending billions of dollars to be involved with a program. Ultimately, for an investment like that, you need to be able to generate. What are some of the characteristics, I suppose, you think a massive global sponsor will have? Well, they've got to be truly global. They've got to be serving global audiences, have a global product. It's got to be valuable to the masses. They've got to be at the scale they can afford to invest just part of their advertising and sponsorship budget to a proposition like this. And that really does limit who you could be talking about. It's going to be FMCG brands. It's got to be global organizations that have a global reach and impact. And that isn't a huge net to cast over. So I do think that these sales cycles obviously aren't quick. You don't call up Samsung and say, hey, Samsung, what do you think about spending a few billion on Olympic rights? It'd be a really good deal for you. Are you interested? It's going to take a lot of time to work through whether there is actually something they can do, because the rights are so carefully managed by the IOC and the Olympics. And then also what you do see in these events is you take away the top partner model, is there's a whole group of partners that happen at the local level. And that's how the local organizing committees generate their income, is through local and more domestic sponsorship deals. And those deals are significant. I can't remember the number. I won't touch my computer because last time I touched it, the computer nearly exploded. But when I was recording, but Paris is set to hit it and surpass its sponsorship targets for the event, but you're talking billions of dollars from the local organizing committee, let alone the international one. So there's big money in sponsorship, and part of the reason is because it's the content, the storytelling, being part of those moments through the media channels that they are servicing. And social is playing just as big a role into that now, which it didn't really 10, 20 years ago. It was all about the broadcast footage and being in front of as many people as possible on free to air.
Now, with the content, with the social, I think brings up a different challenge for these events where you don't get this week by week, day by day storytelling. Sometimes you're talking months, years in between events. And one of the things we've talked about before, the reason the Premier League loves Sky is that Sky has a dedicated Premier League channel. They do as much marketing for them as the Premier League does for themselves. We've talked about Formula One supposedly stayed with ESPN taking less money than going to a Netflix or an Amazon, because those two businesses didn't have that marketing wing to be able to push content and keep them in the news all the time. When you have these events like the Olympics that are every 2 to 4 years, I say 2 to 4, 2 between the total, 4 between disciplines, or something like the World Cup, do you think there's as much responsibility on the rights holder versus the broadcaster in terms of who needs to be pushing those stories as frequently as, say the NFL does with its partners, or Sky with the Premier League? Who's the onus on to keep those stories going? If that question makes sense. I feel like there is a different dichotomy.
Yeah, great question. I think now what you do see for most good brands is that their activation budget is normally more equal to or more than the sponsorship budget. So basically, once you do the deal, you've got to then spend a lot of money to activate it to get the most value from it. Now, that's where it does get tricky on how you define what rights and what visibility you're given as part of those types of deals. So that's where it gets very tricky. It's very case by case. In the Olympics example, there is so little visibility in the venue, in the stadium, in the arena, that you've got to find it in other means, and there isn't that many they provide in the broadcast itself. So yeah, they're carving out those rights is a really, really important part of it. They will have that's probably where the most of the negotiations happen, to be honest, as to how to do that. The activation bit is a key part of it, where they got to work out how they want to spend. That's when they normally bring in a major media agency, an agency, not necessarily a media agency, but an agency and a media agency perhaps, to make sure they're spending marketing budget the right way because they get the image rights to be able to use that others don't. So they'll spend a huge proportion of their budget to make sure their branding's visible across every key market they have available to themselves. And then they'll work with other agencies to maximize the activation opportunities those events have. Those things can be like creating destinations in the city to maybe have engagement with. I think there was one of my friends was working for a major agency, used to do Budweiser, the Budweiser sponsorship, and I don't know if that was the World Cup or the Olympics, but basically they had a boat. They hired a massive boat out, created a big party boat basically, and had it docked in the city, and they're just bringing people there, getting them immersed in the brand, building credibility, building value about that connectivity, and they get rights that they can use to help tell the story and build credibility on the brand. So yeah, it's massively on the brand to do it. It's also these days you see more the lower tier sports rights that they have to help the brand tell more stories. And so I think that's way more part of the conversation now. What sort of content can you create for us? And now that we're a brand partner, to help make sure we're part of the conversation that you're creating around these events. And one of the things that I think happened, which I think to mixed reviews, was when the Olympics again did the Olympic Channel. That was like something like $500 million project to launch. And one of the reasons they did that, they want to make sure they were visible and part of the conversation in between the respective Olympics and tell more stories and ultimately create a new asset for sponsors and partners to be supportive of. Now, I've talked to Mark Parkman on the pod, who was a general manager through the launch and for several years after launch. And he said to me, I think he said it online, that they were running a profitable organization. But was that a success in terms of driving more value for its brand partners? I know that they had some brands that supported it, but was it to the level? I'm not sure. I think some people would be question that value. So, but my point is that the ISC looked at ways it could tell more stories, provide more assets to its brand partners, and I think it's always on the onus now of the sports property, the sports events rights holder, is to work out how they can provide those extra layers of storytelling that brands want, to make sure that when fans walk away from that event, they know that brand was involved and they were supportive, and they're now more credible in the eyes of that fan because they were involved. That's ultimately what they're all trying to achieve, right?
One of the things I think is perhaps a bit interesting, I think about the NFL. They say, no one's bigger than the Shield. The NFL is the biggest thing there is. But I feel like some of these major events, it tends to be more individual focused. I even remember this last World Cup. I feel like there's a lot of talk around Messi, obviously, who finally hit that last pinnacle in his career. You think about things like the Olympics. It's not to say there aren't team sports in the Olympics, but there's certainly the Usain Bolts of the world and these individual athletes. And hell, even when the dream team goes out, there's still this big persona of the basketball. Although, I'll be honest with you, the way Europeans are dominating the NBA, I don't think there's any guarantee of success for the USA men's basketball team. But how important do you think individual stars are and the role social media plays with driving some of these events, particularly like we talk about keeping fans engaged? Is there a bit more reliance on those individuals to carry those sorts of moments?
Great question. I've got to tell you a story before I get to the athlete bit, because something that came to mind from a few years ago, which got a lot of people laughing and in awe when it was made. It was when we ran the brand conference, must have been 8 or 9 years ago, maybe 7 years ago. We had the head of sponsorship for Muller. And Muller is, I think it's like a yogurt company. I don't know what other stuff they sell, but they're big things, yogurt and no doubt other dairy-based products and things they sell to the customers. And they were the major sponsor of the British athletics program and I think it was the London 2017 World Championships, if I remember correctly. And the line that he used, which it did get a lot of people thinking and questioning, was basically he said, yeah, we get all these rights to use the branding and the imagery from British athletics and for this event. But quite frankly, we give them so much exposure by using their branding on all our products that actually they should be paying us for the visibility that we're giving them and not the other way around. And everyone was like, oh, this is creating this is an interesting predicament. We didn't really expect this to come up, but it did raise a lot of questions that if you are partnering with the right brand, it's a bit cliche to think on the partnership side, but I wonder sometimes, because in some eyes, maybe sports is not as valuable asset as it used to be because of the power of social media, that the whole notion that by having the rings or having that logo on stuff? Is it going to transform the business, or are they actually going to add value by creating more exposure for you? Is an interesting question to answer when people are looking at the role that sponsor brands can play in those partnerships. But your question around the athletes is a really interesting one, because if you follow the Olympic movement, there's been a lot of questions and disappointment, I should say, over the last few years, particularly with the growth of the athlete brand, as to how little a brand can do during the Olympics. And the same goes with other events. So effectively, the athletes are really hamstrung. Now, I know there's been some movement on this, and so I haven't looked into it recently, but there have been organizations that have been set up. I think it was Athletes Unlimited was the one I remember last time. That was basically set up to lobby, I suppose, the IOC and the Olympics to give more flexibility, give more rights to the athletes to be able to, post their own race, show some clips from their experience, whatever it might be. They were so hamstrung, they weren't able to leverage the moment that is the Olympics, and which only comes around again every 4 years for these athletes. They don't have ever an opportunity like that. And if you're in a sport where you're in a tier 2 or tier 3 sport, this is your chance to cash in on that visibility, which is a bit different to say your major US basketball stars, right? They obviously already have a platform and a huge audience base. So the role that athletes play, I know there's been a lot of discussion about changing that dynamic, but because of the rights restrictions and protections that the IC has had, it's been so careful on what rights are made available to create that, not FOMO, but like such limited brand exposure to anyone else outside of their core partners, that it filters through to the athlete, and that's really difficult for the athletes to digest, because a lot of these athletes are basically, they're not professional, like in the sense of earning a serious income. So how can they generate an income? It's through storytelling of their brand partners, etc., through their social media channels, which are millions and millions of followers. So where I'd like to see it to go is a much bigger relaxation of those rights. And think about every major athlete. Let's think of the 100-meter final, and every major star running that race is broadcasting the live race, or the immediate, or at least the immediate non-live right. So it's the replay is basically set up ready to go off their platforms within a few minutes after, just to protect those live rights for broadcast partners. Think how powerful that would be, the reach and scale and the engagement that it would get for the broadcasters, maybe if their logos and stuff is on it, for the athletes themselves, and of course for the Olympics, because the moments in this industry matter so much. I'd like to see that happen, but unfortunately, what you see is quite the opposite. There was a lot of stories about the fact that when the Olympics is around, or the World Cup is, well, you will see a set of highlights shared, because in that market, the highlights are available to be shared by the broadcaster quite freely on social, because that's the deal. But then I get served it and I can't watch it because I'm not in that country. So I keep getting served posts to content I can't actually watch. And if you're the customer or consumer, that's really, really annoying as an experience. You get disappointed, and you don't go, oh, I need to go find it. You give up, right? You just go, oh, screw it, I'm going to move on to something else, because that's the way society works. So I just really think that at some stage, the next, say, array of deals in the future, they're going to have to be more flexibility given, because the value of reaching those audiences at that scale is going to be off the charts. Like the billions of social views they'll be able to generate through broadcasting non-live or live content through athletes' channels as that opportunity matures is going to be insane once they work out how to make it work financially anyway.
Well, I don't know if you remember this, Nick. We spoke to our friend Karsten Toda, who set up a company called Avatar, which was a bit unfortunate with the launch right around COVID time, but they've evolved in what they're doing. But his whole idea was essentially, Nick, what you just said is, instead of having exclusivity on everything, we are just the most inclusive company ever. And basically the way he described it is, imagine if the Olympics never existed, how would you design it for 2024 for Gen Z? And the whole idea was, we wouldn't have broadcast deals. We would have YouTube influencers, Twitch influencers, TikTok influencers, and everything would just be distributed across their social channels. And the way we'd speak to sponsors is, you don't have a sponsorship deal, you'd sponsor an athlete, but each one of our athletes has over 1 million followers on their channel, gets 10 million videos, whatever. That's how you're going to make your money. And his whole thing for designing this was a modern day Olympics, just including like what kind of events you would do, who'd be the participants in the broadcast and sponsorship strategy, which a little bit what you just discussed right there is stop being so exclusive and actually let the walls down, and you might make money in a completely different way.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it'll be a really interesting. That is a great model. I would love to see how that can play out in the traditional sports terms as well. But just because so many stars now have such insane audience and follower bases, and they become media businesses in themselves. So I'd love to see how that opportunity could be tested. It could be something simple as you've got one of the big athletes. Let's say I'm trying to think of a star off the top of my head. I'll say Bryson DeChambeau, who's the golfer. I'm not sure if he's actually going to play in the Olympics, but let's just pretend he is. I saw some of his stuff recently. He's nearly got 1 million subscribers on YouTube, and you say, look, we'll do a rev share. We'll live stream our content or your round at the Olympics or at this major event through your channel. There'll be a rev share of all the advertising revenue generated. Bryson gets a cut. The local exclusive broadcaster gets a cut for that market. And YouTube will obviously take their cut because that's how they make money. It'd be interesting to see if that I don't think it's going to cannibalize their audience for their generalist consumption. So all of a sudden you tap into a new audience base and a new revenue stream. It's probably a really bad example, Bryson DeChambeau, given, but he's a big influence at the moment. I'm sure there's lots of other great athlete examples who have created huge follower bases that you could tap into that opportunity, whether it be YouTube or on other social media channels, but particularly YouTube because it's already built for basically broadcasting live. It'd be set up for it. So I think that is really an exciting opportunity. I'd love to see, I've said it before around when we talked about athletes before, but let's say you're watching again, a Euro match, the next Euro match, and you just want to watch one player's performance through there, and they've got a channel set up. We'll just broadcast a single cam on that person and watch how they play. That would be just a cool way to just you've got a new asset and it's available on the channel. Might not be the best viewing experience, just watch one person for a couple of hours, but it's again just a new product serving an audience that wants that type of thing. They want exclusive access to content around that athlete or that creator, right? So I think there's just lots of opportunities around there that we are still yet to see unlocked. And I do think Carson was onto something in that model. And I think sports could learn something from it. And it just has to be a little bit more ambitious somehow. The trick is around the legalities of it all. And the major events are probably the hardest to pull it off because, the hardest alongside the top tier sports because their media rights deals are hundreds and hundreds of pages these days. So good luck trying to find a gap in those.
Yeah, I mean, it's hard to turn down the money, to go completely shake up the whole model. But you talked about there are ways to potentially break this down and do different things. But one of the things that is interesting when we talk about these events, like the Olympics, like Wimbledon, even what the Tour de France is doing with its tech partners, these broadcasts, when they are done, seem to really push the bounds compared to what we see in regular broadcasts in terms of the technology and the distribution, some of the different features. Why is it that these events are able to go a little bit beyond what we see in just our standard Premier League Saturday, Sunday coverage, our just typical Sunday NFL coverage?
So, I think the main reason is they have 12 months to plan, or in some cases 2 years or 4 years, right? So that just gives them an ability to get all the ducks in a row. And you look at those major events that I can think of, like, Tour de France, Wimbledon, the Masters. They're targeted at probably an older demographic, yet they have some of the highest quality technology integration that is really leading the way because they've got 12 months to build to it. They've got nothing else on their agenda. They're huge cash cows, so they can afford to spend 12 months a year on task. Whereas some other events that aren't at that sort of level might only be able to really focus on those types of events or initiatives for a couple of months in the build up to it. They've got other things that they've got to work on. So having a long runway with planning, with time to work with technology partners to make sure you can test and iterate again, allows them just to get way ahead of the curve with some of this stuff. So I don't know how you are able to make that work in such a regular, fast-paced environment. Also, I do remember that what's an interesting thing is how the broadcast production is managed. So in some instances, let's say with the Olympics, it's OBS, which is effective. It's been connected with the Olympics since the beginning, but it is a third-party organization, but is very connected with the Olympic movement. They produce all the broadcast services, the broadcast production, and that production is then given to its broadcast partners to use. Wimbledon does similar, where Wimbledon took in all of its broadcast production after historically outsourcing it or took the bulk internally. I think ASO does a lot of it themselves. Now, they use service providers to help them obviously deliver that from a connectivity perspective, but they control a lot of the broadcast production themselves. And then they just distribute that to its partners. So part of those deals is that ability to have access to that high quality footage. They know that the quality of what they're delivering and is being delivered to consumers is of standard right across the world. Yeah, I think having a long runway is something that perhaps the industry has to appreciate, I suppose. But in instances where they say the Premier League, well, broadcast production is actually done through IMG. So it's not done internally. So I think there's just some interesting components of that as to why that perhaps they're able to really just be so on task 12 months of the year to make sure they deliver the best possible broadcast experience that others just can't, because they're always trying to deliver. They're just in the delivery mode instead rather than planning and strategy.
Yeah, that makes a ton of sense. So, Nick, to sort of wrap things up, we've got all these big major summer events. Is there one in particular that you're either already currently watching, looking forward to the most? And maybe it's not one of the ones we're talking about this summer. Maybe there's another annual event that I'm not aware of that's, maybe, close to your heart as an Australian. Is there a particular one of these major events that, you get most excited about or you'll spend your most time watching?
Oh, it's a great question. I'm trying to think of something more crafty. This year, I'm gutted I won't be around in Paris or for Paris. I think it'd be a great experience to have the games there. They've picked such an incredible array of venues and locations that is the city's going to feel alive. It's going to be so cool as a tourist to come to somewhere like Paris and experience the city amongst all these events. I think London did a pretty good job with that. Like, you could definitely feel a sense of vibrancy when London had it, because London's so, I guess, similar to Paris in terms of its traits, I would say. But I think that Paris is going to be on a whole other level in terms of it really distilled into the entire culture. So that's going to be a really cool event this year. Annually, from a viewing experience, last year I really got into the Tour de France. I got right into that. I think it massively helped to have things like the Netflix series that they have, and there's the precursor. I think it's called Unchained. That really, again, it's cliched, right, with the Formula One stuff, but it made a huge difference, because then all of a sudden I'm watching it. And the thing is, if you're not watching cycling, there's all these random names popping up, and you don't really know who they are. You're trying to work out things. But quickly, when you watch a documentary series like that, all of a sudden you have the gist of what the stories are and the background. And so you can get right into it really quickly. So I really got into the Tour de France last year. So I'm not sure if the time zones will work for me here, but I would probably follow that. And golf, I've been watching a few more golf tournaments lately. Fine. I used to not like watching golf. I don't know if it's because I've got older. Like, I've played golf a lot over the years, but I never really enjoyed just sitting and watching it. It's sad, but I'm really into watching those major golfing events these days. So I've watched a lot of the majors this year, and I find them pretty captivating. So the US Open just happened, was a really cool experience. And so I don't know. I'm watching lots more major events these days, because I don't know, I have better time zone connectivity to the US, which I think probably helps, and a bit more time on my hands. So definitely enjoying that. What about you?
So I said it before, I'm not a big Olympics guy. I know that'll disappoint some people, but I'll be honest, Nick, I don't watch a lot of individual sports, although I'm going to tell you my answer is an individual sport. I don't know. Does it? Usain Bolt was fun to watch. Michael Phelps was fun to watch. It was really more the individuals. World Cup and Euros, obviously, kind of. But I will say the one I love, and it's part of a tour. It's just this is the one that gets all love. I'll still say my favorite annual sporting event is the World Darts Championship. It's not even about the technology, the broadcast. It's just vibes. I love the World Darts Championship, and I think I've seen more coverage since Luke Littler, talking about the star power of things. I've seen more coverage of darts outside of the World Darts Championship since he came along. But for me, like I said, I don't watch individual sports, but I love the World Darts Championships. It's the bee's knees.
And that's just a great example, right, of why one-off event moments are so critical to get people closer to it. But are you going to become a 12 months a year fan of darts? Probably not. That's okay. You don't have to become one for it to be a really successful event, and that's up to the bodies that run these sports to try and drive fans and try and increase interest in the other events. But hey, it's okay if you don't, as long as you have these amazing events that drive fandom, excitement around your sport, then that's all you need. And the Dart Championship is a great one. I still have not gone to that event, so it is on the list. I think if you live in London long enough, in the UK long enough, sorry, I think everyone wants to go to the darts at some stage, at least once. And normally, if you go once, you want to go back again. So Matchroom have done an incredible job with that.
Yeah, I got hospitality seats through a friend who works in sports betting. Was sat next to Louis Capaldi, and a member of One Direction. Not one of the big ones, one of the side. Not one of the big ones like Harry. But yeah, I was in hospitality. You don't get to dress up like everybody, but having beer on tap and never having to get out of your seat, and when that much beer is consumed, having private restrooms from the rest of the delegation was definitely worth the hospitality.
Oh gosh, yeah, I can imagine that would be the case, especially at the Darts Championship. But yeah, that'd be a cool experience. I have to do that at some stage in the future.
Awesome. Well, appreciate everybody for checking in for this episode, and we'll see you next week.
Thanks, everyone. Now, before you go, if you liked what you heard today, be sure to rate and review and just let me know what you think on social. You can find me on most social platforms as SportsPro Nick. And please do spread the word of the podcast. There's no better way of marketing than word of mouth, whether that be in person or on social media. And if you don't like what you've heard, or you think we should be doing more or less of something, then reach out and let me know, as I'd love to hear from you. Thanks, Stream Timers. Until next time.